Imagine a store that lets you get anything you wanted. An HD flat-screen TV, a high-capacity, ultra-quiet washer and dryer, a complete living room set. And imagine if you didn't need a lick of credit to get it. That store simply believed in you. Imagine if they even delivered it, set it up, and serviced it at no additional cost. Well, that store exists. That's Rent-A-Center. Imagine that. No credit needed. Affordable payment plans. Delivery, setup, and service included. Imagine new possibilities at Rent-A-Center. Rental purchase transaction. See store for details.
The best way to live with diabetes is to not live with it alone. That's why Walgreens pharmacists are here for you 24/7 with expert advice and savings on medications and supplies. Just bring in your prescriptions. We can even show you how to get rewarded for healthy behaviors, like logging your glucose. Because Walgreens knows that taking control of diabetes takes an extra hand. Walgreens, at the corner of happy and healthy.
Get a free private consultation with an expert Walgreens pharmacist today.
We no longer accept that miracles have happened in our country, and I'm telling you now that miracles are what built this country. And if we don't learn from our mistakes, if we gloss over the massacres, and then we dismiss the miracles, there's no chance of putting this country back together. None.
Glenn Beck, weekdays 3 to 6 p.m. on AM 1650 WHKT, The Answer.
Well, here we are. Whoa. Here we are again. This is Justice for All. I'm George Yates. It must be a little bit after 2 o'clock. Oh, yeah, it is. Let's see. It's about 2:06, and we're here on WHKT 1650, and we'll be here for the next couple of hours on Justice for All. I'm here with Greg Hall and Dee Thomas, and we're going to talk a little bit about Selma. You know, that was kind of the story of the week, and we're going to have a guest on that knows a lot about not only Selma, but the aftermath of Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this was kind of fascinating, wasn't it, Greg? As we started getting ready for this show, we started doing some research. And I don't know how many people out there that saw this big event. Obama went down to Selma and was on the bridge with John Lewis and this Boynton lady. Apparently, she was the one that was beaten senseless on the bridge, right, during the Bloody Sunday, they call it.
Right, and I didn't have any idea the significance of it before I saw that. And we decided to do a little bit of research before the show.
Anyway, around here, March 7th, there's a famous date called March 7th in Virginia. We always call it the Ash Wednesday storm, or the March 7th storm. Back in when I was a little kid, and most people don't remember that because they weren't born when I was a little kid, but there was a giant storm. The biggest storm that ever hit Virginia Beach was on March 7th. Probably 1967, 68. And it just devastated Virginia Beach, flooded Virginia Beach, just tore up the whole Virginia Beach ocean front. Anyway, so that was another famous March 7th around this area. But it turns out that Selma was on March 7th of 1965, and it was a march from a peaceful march being organized by the Reverend Martin Luther King and some other civil rights advocates, and they were walking from Selma to Birmingham, which is 51 miles. And while they were crossing that Edmund Pettus Bridge, some Alabama state troopers decided that they weren't going to allow this to happen, and so they came out there with some violence and billy clubs, and there was a bloody confrontation there on that bridge, which was caught on the media and broadcast all over the country and all over the world. And it brought incredible attention to the plight of the disenfranchised black voter in the South. And if any one event has ever triggered a civil rights movement, it was this incident in Selma on March 7th, 1965. That's why it's so important. I think for a lot of us, okay, Selma, March 7th, 1965. Okay, Martin Luther King walking around. Well, a lot of us weren't born 50 years ago. So for the younger people, what in the world was significant about Selma? And you have to really look at Selma and what occurred not only on that day, but have to look at what happened after Selma to appreciate the full significance of it, because it was August of 1965 that the Civil Rights Voting Act was passed. And that probably would not have happened had the incident in Selma not been so publicized, because it brought such attention to the problems with voter registration and black disenfranchisement. And so as we began getting ready for this show to say, well, what's the significance of Selma and what's the significance of this Voting Rights Act of 1965, you have to look all the way back into history, all the way back to the Civil War, if not all the way back to the founding of this country. Because when we founded this country, we made this determination that slavery was still going to be allowed, and we cut a compromise between the northern states and the southern states, really, upon the founding of the country, to allow this slavery thing to go forward. It was a pure political power play to allow slavery still to exist. Thomas Jefferson didn't like slavery, but he knew that it was a necessary evil. He owned slaves himself. And by the time we hit 1848, 1854, we have the rise of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln. And really, the Republican Party had no traction at all prior to just before Abraham Lincoln was elected. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected, he, of course, was a strict anti-slavery person. And as soon as he was elected, the South seceded from the Union. We had the Civil War. He freed the slaves by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The war ended in 1865. Lincoln was assassinated. Andrew Johnson was his vice president. Now, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. And the Republican Party, where the Republicans, of course, was Lincoln's party. After the Civil War, we had this situation where the Republican Party completely controlled the South. Prior to that, the Democratic Party was very powerful in the South, and the Republican Party was, of course, pretty non-existent up until when Abraham Lincoln was elected. After the Civil War, we had what they call that period of Reconstruction. Union troops occupied the South. There were Union troops in every major southern city and every major southern state of the old Confederacy. And so they were there to enforce the rights of the newly enfranchised black voters. The 14th Amendment was passed not long after the end of the Civil War in 1866. Now, did you know, dear listeners, that the Republican Party, 97% of the Republican Party voted for the 14th Amendment. Not one Democrat voted for the 14th Amendment. Zero. The Republicans had taken over the South and had given the voting rights to all black men, because women didn't vote either, white women didn't vote either. So when you talk about registration and you talk about who was able to vote in the new South after the Civil War, black men were given the vote. And statistically, 90% of black men in the South had the vote after the Civil War. And we're talking 1866, 1867. And the 14th Amendment had been passed over Democratic objection. And of course, the 14th Amendment is what gives the states, gives power. The Constitution requires that states follow the United States Constitution on equal protection of the laws. So from a period of time between about 1866 and 1876, black voter participation was very high in the South. The Republican Party was controlling the South through its war powers, really, because they were victorious in the Civil War. But the white majority in the South was still very upset about the fact that their way of life had been changed, and so I still can't really hear myself. Am I coming through on the radio?
That's okay. Everybody else
can hear me out there, folks. I think we got a little technical difficulty. There we go. Anyway, so in 1876, for what it's worth out there, folks, if you're following this narrative, there was the most disputed election in presidential history. And, everybody everybody here can probably remember, Bush v. Gore, which was only 15 years ago. And the United States Supreme Court had to actually stop the counting of the votes in Florida and give the election to Bush. But that election was nothing compared to the election of 1876, and that was the one where the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, was actually beaten in the general election by all accounts, did not win the most votes. The Democrat was a fellow named Samuel Tilden. And the problem with it is because we have this electoral college system and because there were problems with some of these electors in various states, there was this incredible dispute as to who was going to be the next president of the United States. And there was a compromise that was reached after the election of 1876. And the Democrats decided that as part of that compromise, they would say, okay, we will withdraw our opposition to Rutherford B. Hayes being elected president. Samuel Tilden withdrew. Hayes became president, the Republican. But in exchange, the Democrats said, Republicans, you're going to have to move all of your troops out of the South that have been occupying the South ever since the end of the Civil War and enforcing voter registration and voter rights in the South for the newly freed black minorities of the old Confederacy states. So after 1876, all the troops left. So now the Democrats who controlled the South and the white majority in the South was able to do what they could do now, and they began to pass laws. And between 1876 and 1890, there was a series of laws passed by every single state in the old Confederacy. And this went on actually between from 1890 all the way to 1910. Every single Confederate state passed laws taking away the rights of black voters to vote. So voter participation by young or even middle-aged black men went from 90% after Reconstruction to 3%, 5%. In essence, the freed black slaves after 1876, 1888, as that time went on, more and more and more black people were unable to vote. Every jurisdiction passed all these different kinds of laws to make it impossible for black people to vote. They would require that they owned property. They would require literacy tests. There were poll taxes. They're now called Jim Crow laws. And so I don't think we read about a lot of those I don't think our children, now they do, but I don't think that during the 1900s, our children, they're reading history books in the South or even in the rest of the country, were being informed just exactly what was going on and how the entire, basically every freed person in the country, black person had been disenfranchised in the South. So what ended up happening was when we have this 1965, we've got this. Whoa, somebody's phone is ringing here. So what Selma did, dear listeners, is drew attention to this fact that just prior to 1965, there was still very little voter participation by, of course, when women got the vote in 1920s, that didn't change anything. I don't think black women were any more likely to get the vote than the black men. Now, what the Voting Rights Act did was change all of that. With the Voting Rights Act came in, and you've done some research on this, Greg, but the Voting Rights Act, which I think the significance of Selma, and this is what Martin Luther King and all of these civil rights workers were shooting for, was to draw attention to this problem that voter rights were just non-existent in the South. That for whatever reason, and of course there would be lawsuit after lawsuit, civil rights organizations, the NAACP, and some of these other research, and there was lots of litigation. They would sue the county, the registrar, the voter registrar of Birmingham or Richmond or wherever. But the problem would be if you took that to federal court, the federal court might vote down, might say, yes, this is illegal, this is violation of the 14th Amendment. They would strike down that law, but as soon as the law got struck down, the legislature would just come back out and pass another law. It was like whack-a-mole. So they never could actually get at the root of the problem. During the entire period of time, of course, this was when the Democratic Party completely controlled the South. And the Democratic Party really was synonymous with white majority rule and racism during this entire period of time. It was virtually an entire century from 1876 to 1965. And when you see how this Voting Rights Act then began and the whole politics behind it, in 1965, in August, when it was passed, it was opposed by many of the Democrats. Virtually all of the Democrats in the South were opposed to the Voting Rights Act. We had Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. He mounted a filibuster. We had Robert Byrd over in West Virginia, and the Civil Rights Act never would have been passed had it not been for Republicans like Everett Dirksen from Illinois, and some of these, I guess you would call them liberal Republicans. They don't exist anymore in the new Republican Party. You can't be a liberal Republican. But the politics of this country have changed so radically in the last 15 years, and you can really talk at when the Democratic Party became the modern Democratic Party, and when the Republican Party became the modern Republican Party. It all began really with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 in August. And it was fascinating if you study how that act was passed. Lyndon Johnson was the president. He'd been the former majority leader of the Senate. He had actually, prior to that, Lyndon Johnson had been a standard Southern Democrat. He'd voted against civil rights acts in 1957, 1955. But of course he became vice president under John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had actually reached out to Martin Luther King in 1960. He got a majority of the black vote. In the election of 1960, he was assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Johnson became president. He was instrumental in getting that Voting Rights Act up and running, but the Democrats were adamant against it. Because the Democrats represented the white majorities of the South, and they didn't want the black voters to be enfranchised. They didn't want their voting laws to be changed. But when that law came out, what was significant about the 1965 voting rights law was that it not only just said you can't pass these laws that disenfranchise black voters anymore. It also said that in order to pass any laws regarding registration of voters or any voting rights laws, they had to get what was called pre-clearance from the Justice Department, because they didn't want to run into this whack-a-mole problem that they'd had before. You know, the legislature of Birmingham or the city council of Birmingham or the state of Mississippi comes out, passes a law regarding registration. You make somebody go to court, file a federal lawsuit, the federal judge tosses it out, and when they pass another law the following week. So now the law says, well, up until the Supreme Court just reversed it during the Shelby versus Holder case, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what it said was, if you have a history of discrimination, if you have a history of passing laws that disenfranchise black voters, then before you can pass any law regarding registration of voters, you have to come to the Justice Department and run it by us to see whether or not this is going to pass constitutional tests on whether or not it's colorblind to people voting. And that was what was the most significant thing about the Voting Rights Act, was not only that it threw out these laws, but it made pre-clearance a requirement of every kind of law going forward. And what was interesting, and that it was the law of the land for many, many years, and it's still the law, except that under the Shelby versus Holder case, which just occurred, I think, in 2013. It was I think a case out of Texas where the Supreme Court has now backed off on some of these pre-clearance provisions in the 1965 Voter Rights Act, basically saying, well, 50 years have gone by, so we don't have that kind of problem anymore. Well, of course, I still think we do have that kind of problem, because we still see the way. I mean, in 2012, 86% of the white voters in Alabama voted for Mitt Romney. So I mean, that's pretty amazing number to say that there's still not discrimination. I mean, 86% of the white voters are voting for the white guy against they're not voting for the African American who actually then became the president. So we have our guest that's going to come on today is a very influential guy, very smart guy. His name is Spencer Overton. He's going to be joining us in a few minutes. He is the director of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and so I've been doing this little rap here on the Voter Rights Act and the Selma and the violence at Selma and why it's important. Because I think for a lot of us, they saw the photo of Obama down in at the bridge, and okay, so there was a bloody confrontation. That happened a lot, didn't it? Weren't there a lot of those kinds of things going on in the South? Well, what in the world were they fighting for? It's not until you realize that there was this disputed election of 1876, which really was the, unless you really study your history, 1876 to 1965, almost a century. But it really, when you think about it, less than 90 years. I mean, 90 years ago, my dad was alive. I've got a 91-year-old dad. So just it was 90 years between Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown versus Board of Education. It's fascinating to see that in our country's history, you've got these things that go on for 90 years from the disputed election of 1876, because when those federal troops left the South as a part of that compromise to allow the Republican to be president, the Democrats got their trade. And so the Democrats ruled the South for over 100 years, and basically segregationist and racist and majority white rule. And they basically went back to a form of slavery because the black people were free, but they were not allowed to vote and were not allowed to be full citizens and full participants in their communities. And when you realize that 32% of the population of Mississippi is African American, and it runs at least just about that high in almost every other southern state. And you realize in our state of Virginia, in 1902, we changed our constitution to, let's see, in 1902, Virginia Democrats implemented a new state constitution which reduced African American voter registration by 86%. It took until 1902. So when we see that this disputed election of 1876, which removed federal troops from the South, so it was 25 years or so, but by 1902, Virginia had said, we reduced African American voter registration by 86%. So after 1902, if you're a black person living in Virginia, you didn't vote. They found a way that if you went to go to the polls, they found a way to say, sorry, you can't vote, whether it was a poll tax or whether it was a literacy requirement or whether it was whether you own property or not. What they would do is they'd say, well, you have to own property if you're black, but if you're white, we'll grandfather you in. This is what they were doing. They were finding these ways. And how do you get around it? Unless you go after it by federal lawsuit and so on. So that all leads us into our interview here today with Mr. Overton, who is a graduate of our Hampton University, and he's the author of Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression. He knows all about this voter registration. He's a professor at George Washington University. And we're going to take a little break here. And after our break, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and really how it has changed our country in the last 50 years. I think we can all see how Democrats in the South have now become Republicans. Most of the newly enfranchised black voters have become members of the Democratic Party. We have many, many more congressmen and elected officials that are black than there used to be. We have a black president, which was pretty historic in 2008. So plenty of strides have been made by the black minorities in the South and in the country, primarily as a result of this Voting Rights Act of 1965 and, of course, the aftermath of the Bloody Sunday on the bridge there in Selma on March 7th of 1965. So we'll be right back in just a little bit with Spencer Overton. Stick with us.
RM Designs T-shirt printing and more is located in Smithfield, but serves all of Hampton Roads. They specialize in vinyl design shirts, apparel, window stickers, cups, and other specialty gifts. They also have rhinestone and embroidery designed apparel, and they offer Pandora-style beads and hardware to create a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more caters to businesses, sports teams, churches, groups, and family reunions. They also offer a great fundraising package should you be in need of money for a special project. And they also do home parties if you and your friends would like to get together and make your own creations. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more can be reached at 757-255-9140. That's 757-255-9140. Email them at rmdesigns11@aol.com or find them on Facebook at RM Twisted Designs. You can also place orders directly off their store at storeenvy.com/RM Twisted Designs.
Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family against any threat? Veteran-owned and operated One Shot Trading Post is ready to make sure that you are. Continuing training and classes on defense, survival, and weapons. Full gunsmithing services, special orders and financing available with military discounts. $15 transfers, and One Shot Trading Post is always looking to buy, sell, or trade. Located at 4366 Holland Road at South Plaza Trail, make sure that you're ready for anything at One Shot Trading Post, 463-5893, OneShotTradingPost.com.
Hi, this is Greg Bigaveris. Join me for Sports Scene each Wednesday from noon to 1 right here on News Talk 1650 WHKT. You can also hear the show on TuneIn as well. We will talk to local, regional, and nationally acclaimed sports guests, and we'll interact with our audience as well at Greg Bick on Twitter. Sports Scene, Wednesdays from noon to 1 right here on 1650 AM.
Denby Baptist Christian School is now enrolling students for the upcoming 2015-2016 school year. Denby Baptist Christian School offers a quality Christian education for students in kindergarten through the 12th grade and an early learning center for preschool children ages 2.5 to 4. DBCS is a ministry of Denby Baptist Church located in the Oyster Point section of Newport News, offering education marked by a biblical worldview, academic excellence, extracurricular activities, and affordability. Denby Baptist Christian School offers daily Bible classes and a weekly chapel service. Call and schedule your tour at Denby Baptist Christian School, 13010 Mitchell Point Road, Newport News. Call 757-249-2654. The mission of Denby Baptist Christian School is to educate the mind, nurture the soul, and shape the character of each student in a Christ-centered environment based on the truth of God's Word. Online at dbcs.org and dbcs-kids.org.
If finances are holding you back from enrolling your kids or grandkids in private Christian schools, call the radio station at 488-1010. We have a partnership program with several schools on the peninsula and the south side that allows us to offer a 35% discount off tuition for preschool through the 12th grade. Give us a call today at 488-1010 or visit our website at tuitionsolution.org. Did we mention we added daycares to the site? tuitionsolution.org.
Okay, we're back with Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and our guest here today is Spencer Overton. He's a professor at George Washington University, and he's the president, I guess, or the coordinator of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, and he's the author of Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression. How you doing, Professor Overton?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, really great to have you. I read your a great piece that you've written here regarding where our show today is on Selma and its aftermath and actually the history that led up to it. It's a fascinating account of voter, black non-voter participation in our society right up until 1965 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Were you in Selma this last weekend with the president?
I was in Selma this last weekend, and it was just an amazing experience. There were people of all racial backgrounds. There were Republicans and Democrats. There were, George W. Bush was down there. Barack Obama was down there. John Lewis was down there. It was really an amazing experience.
For those of us that, a lot of people weren't even born in 1965 and don't really study history. And I've been talking about it a little bit for the last 30 minutes, but you know obviously a lot more about this subject than I do. You're a professor at George Washington University, and you've written a lot on this subject. What is the significance of Selma in your mind? It's a very symbolic event. What's so important about Selma to make the President of the United States to go down there and make it the centerpiece of this week's news?
Well, Selma was just a turning point in terms of the civil rights movement. You'll remember that in Selma, before this march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, very few African Americans were registered to vote in Selma. You remember that about half of the county was African American. but only about 1% of the African Americans in that county were registered to vote, and all of the elected officials were white, and they used interpretation tests, and they'd closed the hours in terms of registration to ensure that African Americans didn't have the right to vote. And so you remember that John Lewis and a group of 600 other demonstrators basically were trying to walk 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery. They crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and as soon as they crossed, they were peaceful demonstrators, they were attacked by state troopers, and this attack was on television. It was broadcast around the country, and it came on, you'll remember, about this that night they were playing Judgment in Nuremberg, which was about Nazi war crimes. And, millions of Americans across the country had an opportunity to see these African Americans who were being pummeled by state troopers simply because they were marching to get the right to vote. And that led a few months later to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which really changed the course of history in terms of allowing so many more Americans to vote and participate, and resulting in just a more democratic American society.
Well, this event, and I guess had this not occurred in such a way, we might have waited a long time for there be enough public opinion to get a Voting Rights Act like that passed.
That's absolutely right. I was thinking that there are two different things going on here. These troopers were kind of playing an old, fourth type of political game. Hey, let's intimidate people with sticks. And these young kids, really, in terms of John Lewis was only 25, they had the media, they had images, they had public opinion. They were focusing on, peaceful resistance. They were frankly certainly engaged in a battle, but a battle with different weapons and a battle with different techniques. And so, they were ultimately successful.
Well, now the Voting Rights Act that was necessary in 1965, it reversed virtually a century of these, I guess, what you would call Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised black voters. Give our listeners, I've tried to give a little bit of the history. What is your interpretation of the history? How in the world did this happen that you have the Civil War, you get the African Americans are freed from slavery and been basically put right back into virtual slavery after a period of time?
Right. You'll remember that in 1870, just following the Civil War, they had the 15th Amendment, which ensured that there'd be no discrimination based on race in terms of voting. And as a result, the numbers of black voters just skyrocketed here, and we had an enormous number of black elected officials in the late 1870s. But then, through violence, through new tools that were not race specific, but were things like poll taxes, literacy tests, other devices, interpretation tests, white officials really drew down the number of black voters. And you remember back then, most African Americans were Republicans, and most whites, at least in the South, were Democrats. And so you got white Democrats who are really trying to suppress black voting strength. In part there is a kind of a white supremacy piece, but it's also political in the sense that they want to, retain their political power, and having all of these African American Republicans really runs counter to their political objectives. So they're able to basically eliminate African American Republicans from the voting rolls, and as a result, we've got basically about 70 years of white Democratic domination in the South until we get up to Selma. And just a quick note, before Selma, even when people tried to bring lawsuits were ineffective because the local registrars would, let's say, use you have to interpret the federal Constitution. to vote or to register to vote, that would be struck down by the court, and the local registrars would just come up with a new test, like an interpretation of state constitution, and the whole process would start all over again in terms of litigation. So litigation really was not effective. They needed the Voting Rights Act and an administrative process to ensure that people could vote in many of these areas.
Well, and when the law was passed in 1965, they put a condition in the law that if you'd had a history of discrimination in this way, you had to actually get pre-clearance from the Justice Department, so you wouldn't have to resort to litigation. They, anytime they wanted to pass a law, they would have to go get it cleared first, and that way you wouldn't have to worry about them just changing it after it's been struck down.
That's right. So you didn't have a lot of these small towns, 10,000, 15,000 people. It's really difficult to bring litigation and prove things, provide evidence. So it really put the burden on localities and states to show that their new election changes were not discriminatory. And so as long as they could do that, the changes would be approved. The Justice Department or a federal court in D.C. would approve of the changes, but that really put the onus to show from the get-go on these election officials that their changes weren't discriminatory. So it's a lot more effective than litigation. It's kind of a situation where an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure, because you could prevent these discriminatory election devices from even being used in an election, and you wouldn't have to try to put the cat back in the bag after a discriminatory election that resulted in the election of particular candidates that were not particularly sensitive to the interests of all voters.
So I have a lot of questions as to how in the world it could take 90 years before someone like John Lewis could draw attention to this. How in the world did the rest of the country just allow this kind of discrimination to go on for so long?
Well, we're all busy. There's so many other things going on. Obviously World War II is big. We have, other kind of national crises. And, just honestly, people weren't wrapped up in something like people not being able to register to vote. It's not necessarily a glamorous issue. It's an administrative issue. It's a local issue. People aren't focused on it. But this march across the bridge and this conflict where these peaceful demonstrators were beat down, it really dramatized this issue for so many Americans. So really kind of teeing it up and framing the issue so that, Americans could see how some political forces and powers in our country would, do just about anything to hang on to political power. That was significant, and that's a, significant and unique contribution of John Lewis. Another point is, you remember 1965, television is just starting to, get cooking as kind of a political tool to rally people, right? I mean, the television news had only been around in a significant way for a few years. You remember, Kennedy had the big debate 5 years earlier that kind of swung it for him. So television was just starting to be used as a political medium here. And so I think that it's kind of this strange confluence of events with people like John Lewis, with this new technology in terms of television, and, all of these things kind of coming together in this special moment on the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
How did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 change the politics of the South and of the rest of the country?
Well, immediately the number of black voters went up. At the beginning of that decade, there was a 30 or 40 point gap between black and white registration. By the end of the 60s, that had narrowed to about 8 points, and that has since closed. For the last couple of elections, black voter turnout in the former Confederate states in the South has been higher than white voter turnout. So its effect was immediate in terms of increasing the number of African American voters, but then it was also significant in terms of what resulted, which was elected officials of color throughout the South, and that number skyrocketed. So in terms of African Americans, around the time of the Voting Rights Act, there were only about 1,000 African American elected officials, and today that number sits at above 10,000. And so it's really been very powerful in terms of allowing participation by African American, Latino, and Asian American voters.
If you just joined us, I'm George Yates, and this is the Justice for All show, and we're here with Spencer Overton. He's a professor at George Washington University. He's the head of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And we're talking about Selma and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After 1965, boy, it's really changed the whole. Used to be the whole South was Democratic and seemed to be voting against civil rights, and the Republicans were very important in getting the Voting Rights Act passed. And now it seemed like now the whole South is most white voters in the South now identify as Republicans, and most African Americans identify as Democrats. It's really changed the whole. I mean, what used to be a Democrat and what used to be a Republican is virtually reversed in the last 50 years, hasn't it?
It has, George, and that's something that's important to recognize. You know, we focus on the fact that, you know, black voter turnout and white voter turnout are about the same. And just a note on that, Asian American and Latino voting rates are about 15 or 20 points behind that of black and white voters. That's even among voting age citizen population. So, you know, there's certainly still some work to do there. But we focus on this turnout piece, but that's, as you point out, that's not the only story that has occurred over the last 50 years. This recent Joint Center report that we put out really does a picture of politics over the last 50 years. And in addition to the turnout story, George, we've got a racially polarized voting story that's going on. In essence, voting has become more racially polarized along party lines in the last 50 years. So at the beginning of the 1960s, most whites were Democratic. At the beginning of the 1960s, a significant number of African Americans were Republican. That has changed in the last 50 years. So we see much more party-based, racially-based, polarized voting. Also on the local level, George, where the local elections are often nonpartisan, do not have a party affiliation, we see race as the predominant factor in terms of how people vote. Race is a more salient factor than income, than age, than education, than gender, than party affiliation. On the local level, we're seeing race as a significant factor. So that's something that, you know, frankly should, you know, trouble us and should, you know, let us know that, you know, race is still relevant and there's still some things we need to figure out.
Yeah, and when people start saying, oh, well, we're not racist, then you see that, you know, 86% of the white voters in Alabama voted for Mitt Romney in the last election, and you just say, well, how can it be? Or when you were in your piece, you're talking about the recent election where a mayor of the black mayor of Memphis, where he gets 99% of the black vote, but 97% of the whites vote against him. I mean, you've got a mayoral election that's completely and utterly based on racial lines. It's just crazy.
Yeah, it really is a significant phenomenon, and we can't deny it. We've got to recognize it. I think another important point that comes out in the report is that the Voting Rights Act has worked wonders in terms of the number of black and Latino and Asian American elected officials, you know, just, you know, increased, you know, tenfold, or if not more in many contexts, right? But still, people of color remain underrepresented in office. I mean, if you just look at the proportion of folks in office compared to where they are in society as a whole, certainly, African Americans, for example, make up about 12.5% of the citizen voting age population, but they make up about half of that number when we talk about city councils in the country. And, you know, certainly we don't expect exact proportional representation. You know, that should never be the goal, but that is one indicator of how integrated different communities are in our politics. So, we have to look at that in addition to other important factors like racially polarized voting, like voter turnout and who's turning out to vote, in order to, just take an assessment of where we are in our democracy.
I'm wondering why it's that way. Do you have an opinion as to why it's become so polarized, as opposed to, we've got wealthy blacks and we've got poor blacks, and we've got wealthy whites and we've got poor whites, and yet it seems that they vote as a block, and yet they're not voting economically, they're voting on another reason.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there are likely a number of factors here that are, at play that, sociologists have studied. To me, what we want to do is really create incentives for both parties to, compete for folks who are of different racial backgrounds. To me, the objective would be, how do we get for people to focus on kind of their common interests, whether those be educational interests or economic interests, et cetera, as opposed to, simply racial interests.
Right. Well, now, there's been a recent Supreme Court case, I think it's called Shelby versus Holder,
right,
which invalidated some of these pre-clearance rules from the Voter Act of '65, right?
That's correct. So basically, they said that the formula that determines which states have to get pre-clearance, that formula is outdated, that it is outdated, and so they struck that formula down. So right now, before Congress, there is an amendment to update the Act, which would basically create a new formula requiring pre-clearance in those areas that have had, a certain number of Voting Rights Act violations in the last 15 years. So it'd be, a new formula there. It would also require disclosure of voting changes nationwide. And, one benefit of preclearance was not just, stopping bad acts. That was certainly a part of it. But another piece was deterrence and disclosure. The fact that these states had to disclose their change, that people would tend to not want to disclose things that were obviously discriminatory. So having a nationwide a provision that requires simply disclosure does not stop any bad change, but disclosure, sunlight in and of itself, adds some value. And the new amendment also makes it easier when you identify a discriminatory law. It makes it easier to go into court, get a preliminary injunction to stop that change before it's actually used in an election.
The Shelby versus Holder decision was 5-4, as are so many of the decisions of the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court, we have Clarence Thomas that votes in the majority. And I think they're trying to move to a new paradigm, I suppose, with the Supreme Court saying we don't want to give special preferences. We want to say that racism is no longer a problem. It's been 50 years. Let's just let everybody go back to the way they used to do things. That's sort of it was the decision. As I didn't. That's not a very good very good summary, I suppose. But to some extent, they're basically saying, "Oh, we don't need these preferences
anymore." I think you
anymore.
captured certainly the spirit of a faction of the court that is here, and so that's the faction of the court, and that's kind of where they are, and they're it's a slim majority here, so that may shift from one side to another, and so that is what it is. That may change. I think what's important for folks who are concerned about voting rights, though, is to recognize that, a court is not always going to be the savior, as it was, let's say, in Brown v. Board of Education, and that you actually have to go out to voters and make your case. Certainly John Lewis, when what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it was broadcast around the country, and the Voting Rights Act resulted, he made his case to Americans nationwide. And so, sometimes people who believe in voting rights and protecting voting rights, have some narrow legal arguments and say, hey, let's have the silver bullet and, go to the Supreme Court and try to protect these voting rights. And I understand that, but I think at the same time, people who are interested in protecting voting rights have to be able to make the case to the public at large as to why this is important and why they should care about protecting voting rights.
Well, that's great, and that's what I was going to lead me to. You wrote a book called Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression, and we got about 5 minutes left. Thank you for joining us, and you said you'd join us for 30 minutes or so. But I was going to, what kind of voter suppression, if any, is going on now? I'm sure you're on top of these kinds of things. That's the one question I've got. And my comment was going to be that it seems in the past that whenever we've seen some of these voter suppression attempts, let's say by shortening the voting hours or by somehow making it harder to, get African Americans to the polls, that
right.
Folks like John Lewis and activists like yourself have said, okay, we're not going to run to court on this. We're just going to do a better job of mobilizing our people. And it seems like it even seems to backfire. It increases voter participation when you see these kinds of efforts to suppress voter registration.
Right. I think that that's right to a certain extent. What I would say is that there are really, George, two different discussions going on, right? There's a discussion that's going on in these state houses, and it's often a partisan discussion. It's a debate about ID. It's a debate about, early voting. It's a debate about same-day registration, how hard or how easy we're going to make voting. It's a debate about, is there fraud? Is there not fraud that's out there? That's a debate. It's a partisan debate, and that's happening in these state houses, right? But there's also something else that's going on, George. In these local jurisdictions, we see changing of election dates. We see the movement of polling places. And I'll tell you, this isn't a partisan debate. Many of these local elections, the majority of local elections, right, are non-partisan elections. And, national, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., they all pay attention to these debates in these state houses because they feel as though they're going to affect the composition of the U.S. Senate or who wins the presidency and are we going to have another Bush v. Gore, etc., right? But this debate that's happening in these localities, it often runs under the radar, right? It's not necessarily covered by national outlets. A lot of times the people who are in these local towns of 10,000 or 15,000, maybe they don't know what's going on or they don't have the money to bring a lawsuit that's there. And so we see manipulation sometimes, not by all incumbents, but by a good number of local elected officials who understandably want rules that benefit themselves, right? And so I think that local piece is something we really have to appreciate, that it's not just about ID, it's not just about, same-day registration or early vote, and all that's important. It's an important national debate to have, but this activity on the local level, we need legal tools to deal with those issues, and those are not partisan issues. Those are issues that we should, really all be behind in terms of ensuring turnout. Local turnout is less than half of that in presidential elections, because local elections are generally at a different time than presidential elections. If you look at Ferguson in terms of this low voter turnout, and do the folks who are in charge in government, do they reflect the people? A lot of that is related to local elections. So, again, voting rights is important across the board. I think we need to do more to really examine and look at these local elections. These are the places where, the people who determine policing, schools, economic development, these local officials are incredibly important.
Well, that's great. We're going to leave it right there. I want to thank Spencer Overton for joining us today in the last 30 minutes here. He's the head of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, a professor at George Washington University, and an expert on this, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and voter suppression. He's the author of Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression. Thanks so much, Professor, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it immensely.
Okay, have a great day.
Thanks.
Okay, we're going to go to a short news break here with CBS News. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the Petraeus deal that he just caught, General Petraeus, who was sort of got himself in a little bit of a jam last year, and he's now pled guilty to some minor offenses. And we'll be back with the next hour of Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and CBS News is coming up.
The best of News Talk Radio, AM 1650 WHKT Portsmouth, The Answer.
We will return to these talks recognizing that time is of the essence, the clock is ticking, and important decisions need to be made.
Secretary of State John Kerry returning to Switzerland to return to nuclear negotiations with Iran. If there's no framework agreement by the end of the month, talks are scheduled to end, a result that analysts say would not be good. One option from Michael Singh, managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
It's possible that what we'll see is a political framework, a very general document that satisfies that end of March deadline, but then continued work to try to iron out those details.
Ever wonder how a group like ISIS raises the money it needs?
Antiquities stolen by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria are appearing on the internet auction site eBay. This includes ceramics, coins, and jewelry. Larger items are reportedly going into storage for release later in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. Last week in Beirut, the BBC spoke to Michael, a so-called fixer who deals in looted antiquities.
Anyone who has antiquities at this point is pretty much being accused of being in league with ISIS.
eBay says it removes items from sale when informed they've been looted. Larry Miller, CBS News, London.
Extremely powerful cyclone, knocking out power and communications to much of Vanuatu. The storm hitting the South Pacific nation with winds up to 168 miles per hour. Vanuatu has more than 250,000 residents, covers 65 islands, many of them underdeveloped. World Vision Director Miles Harrison says people there could be in dire need.
Without shelter and without access to clean water, having lost probably most of their household items with these winds, we are really concerned about their well-being.
Emergency crews continuing to monitor a landslide next to a West Virginia hilltop airport. It's already forced residents out of a few dozen homes in Charleston. Authorities concerned that heavy rains over the weekend could worsen that situation. The president's high-profile visit this week to the Veterans Hospital in Phoenix, trumpeting progress being made in waitlisting not going down well, with Arizona Republican Senator John McCain.
Thousands of Arizona veterans continue to experience unacceptable delays in VA care. The Obama administration has been slow and reluctant to fundamentally reform VA operations.
It's what you do if you're thinking about running for the White House. You visit New Hampshire. Although they are carefully avoiding declaring themselves presidential candidates, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and former Florida Governor Jeb Bush making weekend swings through New Hampshire with all the marks of a White House bid. The traditional greening of Chicago today for St. Patrick's Parade. The Chicago River today dyed bright green.
It's amazing. Look at it. It's bright green.
Yep, she's one of tens of thousands taking part in festivities there today. St. Patrick's Day, of course, isn't until March 17th, but parades this weekend in Chicago and Boston. This is CBS News.
Your eyes are the windows to the soul. Did you know they're also the windows to your health? Because they let eye doctors see what's going on inside. Think about this. A comprehensive eye exam can be an early detector of serious health problems, like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure. Shouldn't you see your eye doctor yearly? Go to thinkaboutyoureyes.com to learn more and find a local eye doctor. And you just might save more than your vision. Brought to you by the American Optometric Association.
Imagine a store that lets you get anything you wanted. An HD flat-screen TV, a high-capacity, ultra-quiet washer and dryer, a complete living room set. And imagine if you didn't need a lick of credit to get it. That store simply believed in you. Imagine if they even delivered it, set it up, and serviced it at no additional cost. Well, that store exists. That's Rent-A-Center. Imagine that. No credit needed, affordable payment plans, delivery, setup, and service included. Imagine new possibilities at Rent-A-Center. Rental purchase transaction. See store for details.
For those of us who choose it over cake and ice cream, today is our day.
You remember pi from math class, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter equal to 3.1415, and on to infinity.
Well, since today is March 14th, 2015, which can be represented as 31415, Pi fans are irrational with glee. For example, hundreds are gathering in Madison Square Park in New York with glow sticks to symbolically represent Pi. Cindy Lawrence is executive director of the National Museum of Mathematics.
We can hopefully convey to kids and adults what pi is, but by making them actually part of the circle and part of the calculation.
There will, of course, be free pie. Sam Litzinger, CBS News.
It's our lucky to be alive story of the week. The Oregon woman who set herself on fire while driving, crashed her car on an interstate, and then jumped off a highway bridge into a park below, survived being treated at a Portland area hospital. I'm Jim Taylor, CBS News.
Private mortgage insurance, or PMI, can cost you thousands. But with the PMI Advantage from Quicken Loans, you may never have to pay those expensive monthly mortgage insurance premiums again. Hi, I'm Jay Farner, president of Quicken Loans, and I'm excited to tell you that the Quicken Loans PMI Advantage is our lender-paid mortgage insurance program. You see, we pay the PMI so you don't have to. Make the smart call and talk to one of our home loan experts today at 800-QUICKEN. You'll learn how the Quicken Loans PMI Advantage can give you more options, more flexibility, and may save you thousands when you refinance. And for 5 years in a row now, J.D. Power has ranked Quicken Loans highest in the nation in customer satisfaction. And this year, for the first time, they've also ranked us highest in mortgage servicing. To learn more, call us at 800-QUICKEN. That's 800-QUICKEN, or visit us at QuickenLoans.com.
Visit jdpower.com for award information. Important terms and conditions apply. Call for cost information. Equal housing lender. Licensed law 50 states. And MLS number 3030.
Well, okay, we're back for another incredible hour on this lovely day. Is it sunny? It's ready. I'm ready for the beach. Looks like a nice, sunny, beautiful day out. Oh, no, it's rainy. Oh. Anyway, my 3-year-old today was going, Dad, can we go to the beach today? And I looked out the window. She goes, oh, it's not a very good beach day. She loves the beach. Anyway, so hi, Lucy, in case you're listening. Well, listen, we've got a really interesting guest. Her name is Marcy Wheeler, and she's a blogger and a contributor to all sorts of media outlets, and one of these people that kind of stay on top of things. She's an investigative journalist, and she exposes gives you the real true story behind the story that you might read in the paper. She's got a blog called exposefacts.org and also emptywheel.net. Her name is Marcy Wheeler, and she's with us today. How you doing, Marcy?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Great. Listen, thank you. We are actually we were going to be talking about the Petraeus. That was our topic, I think, that you were on top of. What's going on with General Petraeus? I know I read something in the paper this week about him entering some kind of a plea agreement for his transgressions with classified information.
Transgressions is a good word for it. So back in 2011, when he was dating his biographer, Paula Broadwell, he was also sharing classified information beyond what she had clearance for. And
he was sharing a lot of himself with her.
He was sharing everything, as it turns out. And we learned this because she had been pestering another person in Tampa Bay,
Right.
worried that she was getting too close. But it kind of disappeared. Petraeus resigned from the CIA in 2012 in the aftermath of the Benghazi scandal. We didn't hear much until in December when a bunch of neocons started going, let our general go. He's been investigated for too long for this. Let our general go. And come to find out that all along, I think people assumed that he had just kind of let her see his email because that's how they got caught. What it turns out he pled guilty to, or one of the several things he pled guilty to. The crime was just he kept a bunch of notebooks from when he was in charge of the Afghan war, and they included really classified stuff. So things like covert officers' identities and code word programs, some of the most secret programs that our intelligence agencies involve.
Wow.
Deliberative conversations with the president, deliberative conversations with the National Security Council. So this is all like real secrets, not the kind of stuff that Chelsea Manning goes to prison for. And he had them in notebooks. He had them not in a safe, which is where those kinds of secrets are normally kept. He had them, ultimately, when the FBI found them, they were in an unlocked drawer in his office, his home office. But he also, so that's the crime he pled guilty for, that he had all of these secrets that should have been in a safe and instead were in his unlocked top desk drawer. And he also shared them with his mistress, Paula Broadwell. He didn't actually have to plead guilty to that crime, but he gave her those notebooks for about 5 days. The government claims that none of that information made it into her biography of him, but there's really good reason to believe that's not true, because she actually described those same National Security Council meetings that were deliberative and top secret, and cited an interview with Petraeus as opposed to the little black books that he had shared with her. But anyway, the government is pretending anyway that information didn't show up in her biography of him. And then the kicker, because this really makes me pull my hair out. In addition to having kept this stuff not in a safe but in his unlocked desk drawer and then handed it off to his mistress for 5 days so she could pop up this biography of him, he also, when the FBI came to him and said, "Have you been sharing classified information with your mistress?" said no. He lied to the FBI. And again, that's a crime they're not making him plead guilty to. So whereas other people, I mean, the crimes that he committed, that he agrees that he committed, are almost exactly parallel to the ones that John Kiriakou, he's the only guy who went to prison for the CIA RDI program because he actually talked about it. The crimes are exactly the same, only Petraeus committed more of them. And John Kiriakou, because he was a whistleblower, went to prison for 2 years, and he's still under house arrest. David Petraeus, because he's not a whistleblower, he was trying to fluff his own identity, and because he's, still advising President Obama, he is going to get 2 years of probation and a $40,000 fine.
Now, what exactly was he? Were these misdemeanors that he pled to?
Yeah. So basically, they
lying
took
to
crimes,
the FBI is a felony.
Right, exactly. But for him, they instead treated it as what's called an enhancement. So they said, well, we're just going to pretend this makes your misdemeanor a little bit worse. Rather than, this is what even Scooter Libby got at least convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison for. David Petraeus doesn't even have to go through that process of being, having a sentence commuted by the president. He just goes straight to the misdemeanor and probation.
Well, now, I'm sure that the explanation for that is that he is a national war hero and he got special treatment as opposed to these other folks who just don't have that sort of status.
Well, that's sort of what you have to conclude. I mean, the government made a big deal out of the fact that for example, the covert officers' identities that Petraeus shared with his mistress never got published. Well, the same is true of John Kiriakou. Nevertheless, again, Kiriakou, 2 years in prison, Petraeus, 2 years of probation. I also think one reason, I mean, there's a piece today from Newsweek, Jeff Stein, who reveals that, and we sort of learned this in December, but he confirms that Petraeus is still consulting with the president. So after Petraeus took conversations with the president and shared them illegally, Obama is still going to have conversations with him about classified information, in this case, the war against ISIL. So that's a big reason why, is that, he's still in close with Obama. And then the other thing is, look, he knows where all the bodies are buried, and I mean, he knows he was involved in some of the more serious covert operations that Obama was involved in. For example, killing Anwar al-Awlaki. Petraeus was there at the beginning and there at the end of that process, and I would imagine that Obama didn't want to give him the opportunity to raise those secrets in a court process.
Yeah, Petraeus is, arguably the greatest military hero of our time. So he does, I guess, get a pass because of that.
Well, I guess it depends on whether you think the surge actually worked or not.
Well, yes.
But he's treated as such.
Yeah, he's certainly given credit for getting us out of that war, whether it it worked or it didn't work, and then wasn't he? And then after that, he was instrumental in Afghanistan. Didn't he come in there after? Didn't Obama have to fire someone for kind of insubordination in Afghanistan, and then brought in Petraeus there as well?
Right, but again, I mean, I think he gets. I mean, the other thing that the Newsweek article today pointed out is that Obama has already pissed off his last two top military officers, Leon Panetta and Bob Gates. Both wrote uncomplimentary biographies, and so he's trying to prevent Petraeus from writing another uncomplimentary biography. So it's all about silencing him in a sense, letting him off of this crime. But I think it really focuses how much this is a double standard, how much that the whistleblowers will go to prison, sometimes for very long sentences. And if you're in the in crowd, you can leak with impunity, basically.
Who was prosecuting him? What district of this was the United States Attorney's Office? Where in D.C. Or who was the USA that prosecuted him?
No, interestingly enough, it's Western District of North Carolina, which gets him out of Eastern District of Virginia, which, you know, they're kind of the leak prosecution. They're the worst because that's kind of CIA's home district. They ended up giving it to the U.S. Attorney where Paula Bradwell lives, so Western District of North Carolina, where, you know, again, fairly military. So he gets passed there. But
my cousin used to be the U.S. Attorney down there. Walter Holton was
Does he want to come back and prosecute David Petraeus, really?
Yeah, so he got a pass because, as you say, he knows where the bodies are buried. So he's a top secret guy. If they prosecuted him for a felony, then he has to come in and then say, fine, I have information that I can give. He would be accorded all the same benefits that you give any kind of criminal defendant. They can come in and give information, substantial assistance to the government. Well, let me give you some information about some other people you can prosecute for leaking secrets and doing this and that. Next thing you know, you've got lots of problems. So, yeah, maybe he did have he had some information that maybe they didn't want to leak out, and they had to do this deal with him.
Right. And something similar appears to be happening with James Cartwright, who here the best parallel is with Jeffrey Sterling, who is going to be sentenced in April, probably to at least a 12-year sentence. Probably it could be as long as 30 or 40 years.
Now, who is he? Who is Jeffrey Sterling?
He was a former CIA officer who the jury found him guilty of. I'm still not convinced, but the jury found him guilty of serving as the source for James Rison's book on a program called Operation Merlin. And the reason I raise his example in comparison with James Cartwright is Cartwright is alleged to have leaked about Stuxnet to David Sanger. And so here you have two people, both of whom are accused of leaking information about a program trying to thwart Iran's nuclear program to a New York Times reporter. As I said, Sterling faces a very long prison term now that he's been prosecuted. And Cartwright, we're getting hints that they're not going to be able to charge him either, partly because the White House had in the past allowed him to leak information, partly because we don't want to piss the Israelis off, partly because they don't want to admit that they're behind Stuxnet. So another high-ranking leaker will probably, in his case, unlike Petraeus, apparently, he did lose his security clearance, but you know, the two tiers of justice on leaking, it's becoming really painfully obvious at this point.
If you've just joined us, we're with Marcy Wheeler, and you're pretty savvy. You know what you're doing. What's your background here to give you these kinds of insights into what's going on?
Oh, I just have followed these forever. The first big case I followed was the Scooter Libby case, so I'm used to all of these leak cases.
And so that's your specialty. You like to get it, and you've got a blog. Then are you pretty a daily kind of thing? Exposefacts.org and emptywheel.net. Is that those are your publications?
And I've got a weekly Salon column, and I do some other stuff at places like Vice and Al Jazeera and Foreign Affairs. So I do a bunch. I cover a lot of surveillance issues. So I've read most of the Snowden documents that have been released, as well as most of the ones the government has released on its own surveillance. And I also do a ton on torture. So I'm not somebody you want to invite to a dinner party, really, because it's all really horrible stuff.
Where do you work out of? Where are you calling from today?
Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Oh, okay. You're out in Michigan now. How do you do your investigation? Do you just do it? Do you get on the phone, start talking to people? Do you go online and read the articles? And how do you do your investigation for your reports?
Oh, I'm best known for reading through the documents that no one else actually reads. So, whenever there's big court cases are easy because all the official documents end up in a docket somewhere. Again, the Director of National Intelligence has released reams and reams and reams of documents about its surveillance programs, and most of them haven't been read very closely, except by me and maybe 2 or 3 other people. So that's the kind of thing that I do.
You look for the little nuggets in those reports that nobody reads, and it somehow just gets buried in the mass of words, and you find the things that other people didn't notice.
Yeah, exactly. That's my job.
Oh, well, good for you. Well, listen, this is kind of cool. What we were talking about Snowden. Where does he fit in? He's like the most famous leaker. Where does he fit into all of this with some of these other leakers in your view?
Well, he's being prosecuted by Eastern District of Virginia,
That's
which
where I
is
am.
interesting. So your neighborhood, which is full of a bunch of national security people, and therefore make it hard to find a jury that isn't going to convict.
Right.
And that's actually interesting because it should have been Maryland, because that's where NSA is. But they said, well, Booz is headquartered in Virginia, so we'll get into our favorite leak prosecution district. And the very same prosecutor who was in charge of the Sterling case, for example, and he was chatting up a bit about the Snowden case, is the guy in charge of the Snowden prosecution as well. And we'll see whether it ever comes to that. I mean, it'd be nice to see Snowden get amnesty someplace more pleasant than Russia. But thus far, Europe is letting us bully them into not doing that.
Well, he's still in Russia, and they're not going to send him back here.
I would not ever claim to be able to anticipate what Putin's going to do. If it ever becomes Putin, if it ever comes into Putin's own interests to sell out Snowden, I don't think he'd hesitate to do so. So, I mean, I think that's one reason why there's some urgency in trying to get Snowden someplace more reasonable.
Right. Well, now I read the paper this morning. Putin, they don't know where he is right now. Where is Putin? Have you examined your sources?
No, I don't. I have no idea. It's interesting.
It's there's a big deal going on in Russia right now. They can't find him.
Yeah, he hasn't appeared for a while. There was a rumor that he was having his love child in Italy, but thus far, that has been denied.
So to finish on the Petraeus story, he pled to this misdemeanor, and you're not sure what it was, the actual crime that was he ever prosecuted for a felony, or did they just kind of come in and negotiate this whole thing out and just let him come in and plead to a misdemeanor and be done with it? Is that kind of how all that? They never actually indicted him for anything, did they?
Nope, no, and they waived a lot of the other things that would provide us more goodies about what he did. So he was represented by Williams and Connolly, the law firm in D.C.
Sure.
And I was joking because they've actually gotten 3 people off on having leaked covert officers' identities, being Dick Cheney, Ari Fleischer, and now David Petraeus, which is a pretty serious crime. He wasn't charged with. John Kiriakou was. But they're huge, big-powered lawyers, and they managed to negotiate a great plea deal for Petraeus, and I'm sure the White House wanted that to happen just as much as Petraeus wanted that to happen. And I think there was some tension between prosecutors and the White House, and it ought to raise questions about influencing of criminal investigations because DOJ is supposed to be independent there. But ultimately, and this is happening with the Cartwright prosecution as well, if the White House has, if Petraeus is accused of leaking conversations with Obama, then the White House gets to decide whether or not that information can be declassified for a trial. And by not declassifying it, this is what they did with Cartwright, they basically make it impossible to prosecute somebody.
Well, now
so it doesn't look like political influence, but it is political influence, making sure that Obama's top people don't get prosecuted when the little people do.
Now, is Petraeus still active duty military?
No. And that's the other thing that, one of the funny things about this is the military for the longest time was like, oh, let Petraeus, let our general go. And there were a good number of people who, once they saw the complaint against him, once they saw the criminal information and saw, I think, two things. One, the sensitivity of what he had leaked, but also that he lied to the FBI. I think there were a goodly number of people who really liked Petraeus who were like, whoa, this is actually serious, and we think that he got away with it. Normally, when you're a retired military officer and something like this happens, and these were secrets from when he was in DOD. These weren't CIA secrets; they were DOD secrets. And normally, when that happens, you brought back, you get docked a star, you get docked some of your retirement, and that also didn't happen to him. So that's another way in which he kind of skated free.
Yeah, whatever happened to Paula Broadus? Was she ever prosecuted for anything? I mean, she didn't.
Silence about that so far. I think they're going to have a hard time prosecuting her, and they've written the criminal information that way, such that she got the information, but she never published it. Which again, I don't think that's true. But so I think she'll probably skate as well. I think that's part of what this plea deal is about.
What in the world? I mean, someone as smart as Petraeus, what in the world would have possessed him to allow her this kind of information? And what good could it possibly do her? He had to know that this stuff wouldn't be published as part of a biography. It makes no sense to me. I can understand how he might pillow talk, might tell her a few things off the record, as don't say anything about this, but actually give her access to documents, actual notebooks where these things are written down, when you know they can't be published in a biography. What in the world possessed him to do something like that?
Well, I think. I mean, first of all, I should go back about Paula Broadwell. Well, she might have criminal exposure for harassing Jill Kelly, which of course is how this all started.
Right.
Given that she was a biographer,
she was the wife of the CENTCOM general, I guess, and she was in Tampa.
Yeah, not of a general. She was just somebody who lived down there who hung out with the generals. Mm-hmm. Paula Broadwell might have exposure in some other ways, but there's no reason to think that Paula Broadwell would have exposure for accepting classified information. She'd be in the same position that a reporter would be.
Right.
And although the Obama administration has gotten close to prosecuting people like that, people like James Rice, and they haven't, and I don't think they would with her. But I think, I actually think it goes too far to say that she wouldn't put that in a book. I mean, again, she describes, it's sort of like the Bob Woodward effect, right? Bob Woodward publishes highly classified information all the time. He gets away with it. No one goes to jail for it because the White House decides to feed it to him. And I think this was very much the same kind of instinct. And frankly, I would be shocked if Petraeus had never served as a source for Woodward's recent books, because Woodward covered stuff that, Petraeus shows up in there, and so it wouldn't be surprising if Petraeus also gave stuff to Woodward, along with everyone else in the White House.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, that's a very interesting observation, because we do see Woodward write these books. He does get a corner seat in the office when things are being said. They're classified.
Right, and just as classified. And so I think that the other person who hasn't gotten prosecuted, who's similarly situated to Petraeus, is Leon Panetta, who, in addition to not getting his biography pre-approved, his memoirs pre-approved in the way they're supposed to, basically invited in the Zero Dark 30 producers to reception for the SEAL team that took out Osama bin Laden. Again, their identities are all protected. So no outside person should be able to come in and say, "Oh, you guys are the guys who killed Osama bin Laden." We worry that they will be targeted by terrorists, and probably rightly so. And nevertheless, Leon Panetta organized this big reception, invited in the movie producers, and when DOD's Inspector General tried to investigate that, because it covered both agencies, the Inspector General got in trouble. They were told that you're not allowed to investigate the leaking of top officials. You're only allowed to investigate the leaking of the schmoes, right? And so, he's yet another person, another CIA director. All of a sudden, John Brennan looks good because he hasn't been caught leaking while he's been CIA director. I think he did plenty when he was at the White House, but he's been pretty tight-lipped now that he's back at CIA. But these CIA directors get to leak anything, and at the same time go out and demand the head of people who themselves leak less sensitive information.
Well, I'm enjoying this conversation. Can you stay with us through the break? We're going to take a quick break here. I was going to ask you some questions about you've mentioned a couple of other, James Rison, who I know his name's been in the news. He's the fellow that wrote a book, and I think he was they threatened to put him in jail. He's a New York Times reporter, right? And you've also mentioned Cartwright, which is being prosecuted. If you could just stick with us for a little bit, I'd like to ask you about those two questions.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to go to a short break. We're here with Marcy Wheeler. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. We'll be right back.
RM Designs T-shirt printing and more is located in Smithfield, but serves all of Hampton Roads. They specialize in vinyl design shirts, apparel, window stickers, cups, and other specialty gifts. They also have rhinestone and embroidery designed apparel, and they offer Pandora-style beads and hardware to create a one-of-a-kind piece of jewelry. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more caters to businesses, sports teams, churches, groups, and family reunions. They also offer a great fundraising package should you be in need of money for a special project. And they also do home parties if you and your friends would like to get together and make your own creations. RM Designs T-shirt printing and more can be reached at 757-255-9140. That's 757-255-9140. Email them at rmdesigns11@aol.com or find them on Facebook at RM Twisted Designs. You can also place orders directly off their store at storeenvy.com/RM Twisted Designs.
Are you prepared to defend yourself and your family against any threat? Veteran-owned and operated One Shot Trading Post is ready to make sure that you are. Continuing training and classes on defense, survival, and weapons. Full gunsmithing services, special orders and financing available with military discounts. $15 transfers, and One Shot Trading Post is always looking to buy, sell, or trade. Located at 4366 Holland Road at South Plaza Trail, make sure that you're ready for anything at One Shot Trading Post, 463-5893, OneShotTradingPost.com.
Hi, this is Greg Picaveras. Join me for Sports Scene each Wednesday from noon to 1 right here on News Talk 1650 WHKT. You can also hear the show on TuneIn as well. We will talk to local, regional, and nationally acclaimed sports guests, and we'll interact with our audience as well at Greg Pick on Twitter. Sports Scene, Wednesdays from noon to 1 right here on 1650 AM.
Denby Baptist Christian School is now enrolling students for the upcoming 2015-2016 school year. Denby Baptist Christian School offers a quality Christian education for students in kindergarten through the 12th grade and an early learning center for preschool children ages 2.5 to 4. DBCS is a ministry of Denby Baptist Church located in the Oyster Point section of Newport News, offering education marked by a biblical worldview, academic excellence, extracurricular activities, and affordability. Denby Baptist Christian School offers daily Bible classes and a weekly chapel service. Call and schedule your tour at Denby Baptist Christian School, 13010 Mitchell Point Road, Newport News. Call 757-249-2654. The mission of Denby Baptist Christian School is to educate the mind, nurture the soul, and shape the character of each student in a Christ-centered environment based on the truth of God's Word. Online at dbcs.org and dbcs-kids.org.
If finances are holding you back from enrolling your kids or grandkids in private Christian schools, call the radio station at 488-1010. We have a partnership program with several schools on the peninsula and the south side that allows us to offer a 35% discount off tuition for preschool through the 12th grade. Give us a call today at 488-1010 or visit our website at tuitionsolution.org. Did we mention we added daycares to the site? tuitionsolution.org.
Okay, we're back with Marcy Wheeler. I'm George Yates. This is Justice for All. And Marcy, we were talking. You mentioned James Rison. He was in the news a lot. He's a New York Times reporter, wrote a book, and they were threatening to put him in jail for not revealing his sources. Whatever happened on that case?
Right. So he was the reporter on the Jeffrey Sterling case.
Okay.
And so back in 2011, when it was originally due to go to trial, the judge in the case, Leonie Brinkema, was like, you really don't need Rison to do this case, and the government appealed that decision to the Fourth Circuit, and then Rison appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Fourth Circuit basically said there is no journalistic privilege. You gotta testify, and so for months leading up to the Sterling trial, which began in January of this year, there was a lot of debate about what was going to happen, and ultimately DOJ decided they did a dry run, actually, in early January, where Rison came on the stand and basically said, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to tell you about what kind of agreements I had with my sources or how many or when or where or what have you. And so based on that, the government chose not to call him to testify. And it had a very weird effect on the Sterling trial because in fact, there was one moment the jury wasn't there, but the judge was basically saying, she said something like, I believe if there weren't a newsman's privilege, you would have indicted James Rison as well. And the defense was like, wait a second, there is no newsman's privilege. But the way in which Sterling was convicted was they basically convicted him. There was never any evidence of him handing classified information to Rison. There was evidence that they were talking, although more later than earlier. So, it seems like Rison had other sources at the beginning of his work on this story.
And what did Rison write? What was the secrets that were supposedly given to him? What was the book about, or the articles that he wrote?
Well, the book, it was a 9 or 10 chapter book. This was State of War, his book before the one that just came out this year.
State of War was the name of the book. Okay.
Correct. And so that book also disclosed the illegal wiretap program. No one was ever charged in that, although they did try and charge Thomas Drake for leaking the illegal wiretap program, but in a way that charged him for other things. So in other words, this is one thing the government does, is they don't want to reveal all the secrets about the illegal wiretap program because then, if Drake was the source, it's not clear that he would be able to say, well, it was illegal, So they charged Drake for other things, and that case largely got thrown out. This is the same book, different chapter, describes how the CIA tried to thwart Iran's nuclear program by giving them nuclear blueprints.
And
so,
this is Rison's book, State of War?
Yeah.
Now, Sterling was convicted. Now, has he been sentenced yet?
That's in April.
Okay, and so they're doing a pre-sentence. Now, have you run, what's he looking at in terms of guidelines?
The max that he'd be looking at would be 80 years. So start the calculation at 40. Right, yeah. But start the calculation at 40 because you never get the full amount. And then the question is whether the judge decides to sentence him consecutively or concurrently. Usually you're sentenced concurrently, and then you'd be looking closer to 12 years.
Well, now that's Leonie Brinkema is the federal judge that's doing the sentencing in that case.
Yep.
And she's a former civil rights. So she did a lot of defense work, and she was the subject of Joel Cohen's book. That when we interviewed Joel, she's a federal judge that she can deviate down from the guidelines too. She doesn't have to. She can sentence him to less than the 12 years, I would suppose. How did she indicate when she was making any comments how egregious she felt the case to be?
The defense, as defense almost always do, said throughout the entire case, and they legitimately said, you've not entered any evidence that he actually handed off classified information, and she did not do that. Unsurprisingly, she let the jury get it. She said, the jury's allowed to convict on circumstantial evidence, but she seemed at the point when the case was going to the jury not to have any clue what was going to happen. And I think there were other journalists and I sort of had the same feeling that he could either skate or be found guilty on one of the charges or be found guilty on all the charges. The latter happened, and there was almost no evidence that the evidence was really thin, but nevertheless, the government told a compelling story and talked about how important this program was. And it was in Eastern District of Virginia where, chances are you're going to have people who have some kind of national security connection. So he was found guilty.
Yeah, it is interesting. In this part of the world, you will find people that just think Snowden is the biggest traitor in the history of the world, of course. And then you can go to other places in the country where Snowden is considered to be somewhat of a patriot or certainly a public servant in revealing this information. But in this part of the world, you're right. A federal jury is going to be composed of people that are former military or defense contractors, or certainly touch on that. And it's a tough jury pool for that kind of offense.
And that's one of the reasons the government loves to prosecute those cases, and probably why they chose to charge Snowden in Virginia than Maryland.
And you sat through this trial. Apparently, it sounds like you were in attendance for much of it.
Yeah, for most of it.
So was the defense for Sterling that Ricin could have gotten this information from other sources, and just because he's talking to Sterling doesn't mean that he got it from him?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, I think that I'd say this happens in D.C. all the time, that somebody says, go investigate what I did for my last 2 years as a CIA officer, without saying anything. If you tell a journalist like James Ricin that, he has the ability to go figure that out because he's got that kind of CIA sources. Particularly, the asset that Sterling was working with was a Russian scientist. James Ricin has written a book about Russian spying, so obviously he's got a lot of great sources there. So, I sort of think that that's what happened. There were other this was bubbling. This story was bubbling out there, and so I have reason to believe that even if Sterling is the source, he was not the only source. When the CIA first referred the case, they told the FBI, we think it's this Senate staffer. We think it's the top Senate intelligence staffer. And I don't know, I haven't been able to figure out why they thought he would have done that, but Sterling did go to the Senate Intelligence Committee and say, I think this program had some problems, so he would have known about it, the Senate staffer. There were some weird things about the case, like there appears to be 2 documents missing, and the FBI doesn't really care about that apparently. But not having found those documents, the FBI nevertheless, the government nevertheless charged Sterling. If those documents did in fact exist, the CIA claims they didn't, but they pretty clearly did, then it would be a lot easier for any number of people to have leaked to Ricin because they would have been able to read the documents. So I sort of think then there are things like the government claimed that the Russian involved didn't have problems with the program. Well, in fact, CIA cables do support not only that he did, but that another Russian involved in the operation did as well. So, and that Russian and his handler never testified. So there are people who might well be very critical of the program, yet they weren't brought to the stand for the defense to cross-examine. So there's a lot. I mean, one of the other things that bothers me the most about this case is to prove that Sterling would leak information, the government introduced these 3 documents that they found when they searched his house in Missouri in 2006. And it turns out they were retroactively classified secret documents about how to use a rotary phone to dial into Langley, dating back as early as 1985. So they weren't secret documents. And And there were 6 witnesses, 4 of whom were read into this program, who also were found to have same crime that David Petraeus pled guilty to, who were found to have mishandled classified information, basically brought documents home that they shouldn't have brought home. That those were found suggests they were a lot more classified than how to dial a rotary phone. And yet that information was never, the defense was not permitted to share that information with the jury.
How damaging was the information that was written in Rison's book? Is it any more damaging to national security than the information that Petraeus gave to Broadus?
Well, the CIA, in my opinion, I think that what was in Rison's book wasn't damaging, but I think that the program got more sensitive as it went on. There are the IAEA is actually re-examining the case that the U.S. has made against Iran, because they said, look, you guys were dealing dodgy documents, and there are these documents that you gave us that have long had problems, and therefore we're going to reconsider them and see if they have similarities to the documents that you had that Russian deal. There's a set of nuclear blueprints that the CIA produced out of Iraq in June of 2003 to try and claim that there was a real nuclear threat there. And again, if the CIA is in the business of creating fake nuclear blueprints, I think you need to look at all of these fake nuclear blueprints that have come along and ask, did the CIA create those documents? If that's where the program went, I think CIA would argue that it was really damaging, but at the same time, that's not what Sterling is accused of leaking. That's stuff that, and besides, I don't particularly want the CIA to be able to dodge fake blueprints and then claim somebody else has a real nuclear program.
Well, this has been a great interview with you. Thank you so much for being with us, Marcy Wheeler.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If you've just joined us, we've been with Marcy Wheeler the last 45 minutes. She's she's got a very interesting and investigative blog called exposedfacts.org, also emptywheel.net. She can be found writing for Salon and various other publications. So, and she is one of those folks that actually reads the documents and gives us the real information behind what people don't actually spend the time doing the research. So thanks. Have a great day, Marcy. She already left us. Okay, great. So that was kind of fun. She gave us some insight in a lot of these prosecutions that are going on for the leaks. It really doesn't draw much of a distinction between what Petraeus did and what some of these other. But you're Petraeus, and that's like he was a household name there for the longest time. It's kind of hard, I guess, to go after him based upon what his perception as being the hero of the surge and getting us out of Iraq and all that sort of stuff. So if you just joined us, I'm George Yates, and this is Justice for All. We got a few minutes left in our show today. I thought what was also interesting, what I wanted to get to before the end of the day was I read an article in this morning's paper, the New York Times, that the Boston Marathon bomber, the one that's still alive, is on trial. That would be the younger brother. I forgot to bring the article with me today, so I can't pronounce his name. It's sort of a Russian name. So those of you that are listening to this show and have the paper in front of them, somebody call in, 454-1650, give me the boy's name. But I guess it was he's being defended by Judy Clark, who's a very famous, well-known, she's a public defender, originally got her start in Eastern Washington. And she is probably the number one capital defense lawyer in the country, I would guess. And she is defending this boy, Tamilov or something like that, Dmitry, I think. I can't remember his name. But he is the younger brother. And so she is now defending the case. He's being charged with capital murder for all those deaths that took place in that terrible bombing after the Boston Marathon. And the article today was her trial strategy in order to save this young man's life. And she pled him not guilty to the charge, but she came out on opening statement, and apparently in a very dramatic opening statement, admitted his guilt to the crime. She's going to force the government to prove him guilty. She's not going to plead him guilty and then have the jury do the sentencing, which is either life or death. She's actually going to plead him not guilty and to make them go through their proof so that each time as they present their evidence, she can cross-examine to try to show that her client was not the leader of this terrible conspiracy to bomb and kill people. And the article in the Times was talking about that particular strategy and how she's employing that strategy. And they drew attention in the article to Clarence Darrow, the great Clarence Darrow, who in the summer of 1924 defended these two teenage sons of a wealthy Chicago family. They were accused of kidnapping and killing a boy named Bobby Franks. And back in those days, in 1924, when lawyers did closing arguments, they lasted for hours. And so they say that this defense that Judy Clark is interposing for this Boston Marathon bomber is going to be using somewhat of the same strategy that Clarence Darrow used in this trial from almost 100 years ago, when Darrow basically admitted the guilt of his clients at the trial, but argued against the death penalty for 12 hours. And the story goes that he had the judge weeping. It wasn't in front of a jury; it was in front of a judge, and he had the judge weeping at the end of his argument. I guess, and he saved their lives from the gallows. And the other trial, which Ms. Clark is going to be drawing from, is one that's of very local significance. Those of us who remember back, I think it was 2002, the D.C. sniper, and there was a young man named, was it Malvo? John Malvo. And that was when there was just these random killings up in Northern Virginia, where people were just like pumping gas in their car or walking from the grocery store, shot down in parking lots, just random killings. And it turned out that there were two men involved. One was much older, one was much younger. I think the Malvo was the younger boy. And he was actually tried here in, was it Chesapeake or Virginia Beach? One of them was tried in Virginia Beach, the other one was tried in Chesapeake, because they couldn't try them up in Northern Virginia. The older one was convicted. I believe he was given the death penalty, wasn't he? The younger one was basically, he got life. And the strategy was, I'm a kid. And the other guy, the older man, was the one that led me to do this. And so, therefore, the death penalty is not appropriate because I just really wasn't the leader. It wasn't my idea. I just went along with it. So the strategy being employed by the Boston Marathon defense is that this boy was the younger of the two brothers. He didn't have a lot of he just kind of basically was following his brother's lead. So that was an interesting story in this morning's paper. I thought, this capital murder thing is always on the top of the list here on our show, because we do talk about death penalty cases a lot, and DNA and Innocence Project and people that are cleared and so on. But of course, this is not an issue in these cases. They're admitting guilt. It's not going to be a question whether they're going to be cleared by DNA evidence or anything else. They did the crimes. The question is it going to be life or death? And rather than plead him guilty, the strategy was that if you just plead him guilty and then all the jury has to decide is guilt or death or life, then the jury's saying basically we're going to sit here all this time and just determine whether or not to give you a break. They say that if their strategy is not to plead him guilty, but if you plead him not guilty, then the jury can at least find him guilty and then give him life. So they've done something. They've punished him by convicting him and giving him life, as opposed to not even being able to make the decision. So it's an interesting strategy where she says on opening statement that he's guilty, but he's not pleading guilty. He's pleading not guilty. Which is not unusual. As defense lawyers, we will do that sometimes. Because there's nothing like admitting guilt to get people to want to kind of show you mercy. And that was Clarence Darrow's argument when he was arguing to the judge in this case in 1924. They labeled this case the trial of the century. Americans around the country wondered what could drive these two young men, blessed with everything their society could offer, to commit such a depraved act. And it's one of the most famous cases that Clarence Darrow ever tried. And the newspapers claimed that Darrow, of course, at the end, it turned out that they thought that Darrow was just doing it for the money, because apparently he was working for two very wealthy families. And it turned out that he did make $30,000 for defending that case, which back in 1924, I guess, was a lot of money. But still, when you're the great Clarence Darrow, that doesn't sound like a lot. And you hear about some of these trials today, when you hear about the millions of dollars in attorney's fees. McDonald's case was a classic. The millions of dollars in attorney's fees that he owes. That's a lot more than $30,000 even in 1924 dollars.
So in the lawyer world, criminal defense world, Clarence Darrow, is he one of the all-time greats?
Yeah, I mean, everybody, Clarence Darrow, I mean, he's like he's the most famous trial lawyer of all time, certainly from the early part of the century.
Well, I mean, if you make a judge cry and then you can go for 12 hours, I mean, and it sounds like it must have been pretty heartfelt.
12 hours. Nowadays, judges will get up there and they'll go, okay, how much do you need for your closing argument, Mr. Yates? 30 minutes enough? And then when you get to be about 31 minutes, you're looking over there, the judge is looking at his watch, that sort of thing. Yeah. You can go a little longer than that, but they want you to be short. You don't get up there. Nobody orates like that anymore. It's wild. You hear about these cases in the past where lawyers would get up there and just talk for days, right?
Well, you've got a book coming. It's not out yet, and it's called The Biggest Trial of the Century, and it's got all these trials that you're talking about in there.
Oh, really?
So we're going to get to go over those, and it's going to be fascinating, I'm sure.
Well, if you've just joined us, I'm George Yates, and I've been here with Greg. And you haven't had I kind of took all the mic today, Greg.
Oh,
I didn't let you talk.
I enjoyed sitting back and listening. I mean, it was from Selma to this whole
Marcy
to Snowden. Yeah, I mean, really.
Betrayus.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we've got a lot of good shows coming up. Those of you who like to listen to this show, I think we've got a show here that nobody else does a show like this. In Hampton Roads, we call it Justice for All, and it's got a legal bent to it. We try to cover some pretty serious topics here, and we go in depth and do a lot of cases and a lot of things that are going on in the legal world. And not today, but a lot of times I get a chance to interview authors of books, and I've got about 5 of them that just dropped on my desk this week. One's called The Barefoot Lawyer, the blind lawyer in China. I got that. What's that book about the woman's guide to the law, which will really be interesting. The one about the convict in Rikers Island, the security guard that went from being a security guard to being an inmate at Rikers.
Right.
He wrote a book about that. We've got that. The Next Species, which isn't exactly a legal-oriented book, but it's going to be what's the next species after the aftermath of man.
Right, and maybe it's talking about how they're going to start integrating modern-day technology into human beings. Right?
And one really fascinating, we've got Bill Browder coming up, I think, on March 28th. Bill Browder wrote this book called Red Notice. I'm really excited. I'm reading this book now. He's the guy, and we were talking about Russia a little bit today. Bill Browder is the guy that was the largest foreign investor in in Russia, excuse me. And he had over almost $5 billion in his fund, and he was thrown out of the country in 2005. And then later on, his lawyer, Gregor Magnitsky, was killed, murdered by some of Putin's cronies. And so this is a book about how dangerous it is to be in Putin's Russia today. If you don't like Putin, if Putin doesn't like you, he throws you in jail and takes all your property. Maybe leaves you there for 10 years. Maybe he has you murdered. It doesn't. He kind of does what he wants. This book describes how 22 oligarchs really own Russia, and Putin, and basically they pay tribute to Putin so they can stay in business, or else he'll throw them in jail or have them murdered too. And Bill Browder, a fascinating guest, and he's in New York, but he'll join us by phone, and we will have him as a guest on March 28th. and we've got a lot of other girly killer authors coming up in the weeks to come. So tune in and if you don't get a chance to listen to the whole show, you can go to my website at ghylaw.com, or you can go to Justice for All with George Yates on YouTube, and we do archive these shows. And so every Saturday from 2 to 4, we have this another installment of Justice for All with some very interesting guests, like today, Marcy Wheeler and Spencer Overton. So anyway, thank you for joining us. This is Justice for All. I'm George Yates. Join us again next Saturday for another edition of Justice for All. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
CBS News, I'm Jim Taylor. Talks with Iran resume tomorrow. Secretary of State John Kerry sounding less than confidently optimistic.
It may be that Iran simply can't say yes to the type of deal that the international community is looking for. But we owe it to the future of everybody in the world to try to find out.
It's a risky proposition dealing with Iran. Joseph Cirincione, nuclear weapons negotiation expert with the Plowshares Fund.
There are risks involved in any deal with Iran, but they pale in comparison to the risks of the alternatives.
Just in, CDC says at least 10 more people exposed to the Ebola virus are being flown from Africa to the United States for monitoring. Battling ISIS on the ground and in the air, U.S. airstrikes continue to pound ISIS positions. Iraqi forces pausing for reinforcements in their fight to retake the city of Tikrit. CBS's Holly Williams reporting from Baghdad.
Destroying ISIS will require effective ground forces because they cannot be bombed out of cities without causing massive civilian casualties. And those effective forces simply do not exist in most of Iraq, where instead they're relying on a ragtag army of some government soldiers, local tribesmen and Shiite Muslim militias. And so far, they're making very slow progress.
Residents in cyclone-ravaged Vanuatu hunkering in emergency shelters for a second straight night after venturing out today to find their homes badly damaged or blown away by the powerful storm. Alice Clements with UNICEF.
It really looks like a bomb's gone off in the town centre. There's shutters scattered everywhere. There's corrugated tin roofs everywhere, and then you'll see a harbour just littered with sunken yachts and boats.
For the first time in 40 years of measurements, carbon dioxide emissions not increasing last year. Research suggests efforts to counteract climate change by reducing carbon emission and promoting energy efficiency could be working.
Essentially, what it says is that we can run our economy with a vastly less energy waste.
Hal Harvey, founder of a think tank, Energy Innovation.
There's no reason why America can't finally control its energy future and produce everything we need to with domestic sources and far less pollution, far less carbon dioxide.
As we hear now from KNX reporter Ed Mertz, law enforcement in California looking to put an end to buying booze for younger people.
They do so by going after adults who buy for minors. Nearly 100 agencies are taking part in Operation Shoulder Tap, where an underage person asks an adult outside a liquor store to buy them alcoholic drinks. John Carr is with the California Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control.
Our hope is that everybody says no. On average, 9 out of 10 people do say no, but we still have people who are out of compliance and are looking at a pretty hefty fine.
The fine can cost up to $1,000.
This is CBS News.
Private mortgage insurance, or PMI, can cost you thousands. But with the PMI Advantage from Quicken Loans, you may never have to pay those expensive monthly mortgage insurance premiums again. Hi, I'm Jay Farner, president of Quicken Loans, and I'm excited to tell you that the Quicken Loans PMI Advantage is our lender-paid mortgage insurance program. You see, we pay the PMI so you don't have to. Make the smart call and talk to one of our home loan experts today at 800-QUICKEN. You'll learn how the Quicken Loans PMI Advantage can give you more options, more flexibility, and may save you thousands when you refinance. And for 5 years in a row now, J.D. Power has ranked Quicken Loans highest in the nation in customer satisfaction. And this year, for the first time, they've also ranked us highest in mortgage servicing. To learn more, call us at 800-QUICKEN. That's 800-QUICKEN, or visit us at QuickenLoans.com.
Visit jdpower.com for award information. Important terms and conditions apply. Call for cost information. Equal housing lender. Licensed law 50 states. NMLS number 3030.
He was one of the last century's greatest symbols of the strength of pacifism.
Described Indian civil rights leader Mahatma Gandhi as a seditious, half-naked beggar, but not far from where he said that, in London's Parliament Square, a 9-foot bronze statue of Gandhi was unveiled, complete with wire glasses, robes, and sandals. British Prime Minister Cameron calls this advocate of nonviolence one of history's most towering figures.
A man whose doctrine became the inspiration for the civil rights movement across the world.
Gandhi's statue perhaps fittingly stands between those of Nelson Mandela and Abraham Lincoln. Larry Miller, CBS News, London.
Miami Beach helping out beachgoers and others who forget to pack sunscreen. The city installing 50 free sunblock dispensers at public swimming pools, parks, and beach entrances near lifeguard stands. Florida sees an increased number of melanoma cases every year, the most serious type of skin cancer. I'm Jim Taylor, CBS News.